The attic door slammed shut behind me. Gary's hands that had fixed my bike, built my treehouse, closed around my throat. I kicked the rusted key free from his grip, the one thing my father left me. The safe deposit box. The truth. And now, the only way out. My lungs burned as his weight crushed me into the floorboards. The man who'd been family for years hissed. Some secrets stay buried. But I'd already seen the name on the key. Linda Vance. My real mother. And if I didn't get to that box, I'd never know why they stole me. Dust motes danced in the beam of the flashlight as Sarah pried open the rusted latch of the cedar chest. The basement air smelled of damp concrete and forgotten winters. She tossed aside a moth-eaten wool blanket, revealing a stack of yellowed newspapers. Tucked between the headlines lay a flyer, its edges curled like dried skin. Amanda Vance, missing 1992. The grainy ink depicted a girl with a jagged chip in her front tooth and a distinctive swirl of hair at the temple. Sarah pulled a silver locket from her pocket, clicking it open. Her own 5-year-old face stared out from the frame. She traced the jagged tooth in the photo, then the identical chip on the poster. A cold weight settled in her stomach. Every birthday candle she ever blew out, every story Martha whispered at bedtime, curdled into a hollow performance. She ran her thumb over the paper, feeling the grit of decades-old ink. The girl in the poster wore mismatched socks, one red, one blue. Sarah looked down at her own feet. Even now, she felt a physical compulsion to never wear a matching pair. It was a rule she had carried since her first memories, a way to confuse the monsters so they couldn't find her. But the monsters hadn't been under the bed. They had been the ones tucking her in. The floorboards groaned overhead. Martha's rhythmic snoring had stopped. Sarah froze, holding her breath until the house settled into its uneasy silence. She crept up the stairs, her socks sliding on the polished oak. In the home office, the scent of lavender and stale peppermint lingered. She slid the bottom drawer of the mahogany desk open, her fingers fumbling through manila folders. The adoption decree sat at the bottom. Under the desk lamp, the state seal appeared blurred, the ink bleeding into the cheap parchment. The date of birth had been scraped away and retyped, the 8 sitting slightly higher than the other digits. Sarah rubbed her thumb over the indentation. The paper gave way, tearing under the pressure of the truth. Her life was a counterfeit, signed in someone else's hand. She began to count the floorboards as she moved toward the filing cabinet. 1, 2, 3. The rhythm was the only thing keeping the bile from rising in her throat. She needed to see the original police report, the raw data that didn't care about Martha's curated stories. Sarah's fingers traced the edges of a heavy ledger. She pulled it out, the spine cracking like a dry bone. Inside, the handwriting changed from Martha's elegant script to David's rigid, clinical print. He had kept every receipt, every scrap of paper associated with her acquisition. There were bills for a private agency in Chicago that didn't exist when she searched for it on her phone earlier that night. Every document was a brick in a wall built to keep her in. The silence of the house was suddenly broken by the heavy thump of a boot in the attic above the office. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She knew that sound. It wasn't Martha. It was the heavy, dragging step of Gary, the handyman who had been a fixture of the Miller household since before she could walk. He was the man who kept the secrets of the house as well as he kept the plumbing. Sarah grabbed the missing person poster and the ledger, stuffing them into her bag. She needed to move. She reached the attic stairs, her voice a frantic whisper. 1, 2, 3. She couldn't stop. If she stopped the count, the safety she had built around herself would shatter. As she reached the top landing, the air grew thick with the smell of sawdust and old insulation. A shadow detached itself from the darkness behind a stack of crates. Gary stood there, his greasy overalls stained with oil, a heavy pipe wrench clutched in his hand. He didn't look like the man who had fixed her bicycle or built her dollhouse. He looked like a sentry guarding a tomb. "You shouldn't be up here, Sarah," Gary said, his voice a low, vibrating hum. He began to chant that funeral dirge he always whistled when he was working on something dirty. Mm-mm-mm-mm-mm. The sound vibrated through the floorboards, chilling Sarah to the bone. "What did my father pay you for, Gary?" Sarah asked, her fingers tracing the jagged scar on her palm. "To keep the sink from leaking? Or to keep me from finding out who I am?" Gary didn't answer with words. He lunged. The heavy wrench swung through the air, whistling as it narrowly missed Sarah's temple. She scrambled backward, her heels catching on a loose piece of plywood. Gary was surprisingly fast for a man of his age, his movements fueled by a desperate, panicked loyalty to a dead man's ghost. He swung again, the metal tool slamming into a wooden support beam with a bone-jarring crack. Dust rained down from the rafters. Sarah grabbed a heavy tax ledger from a nearby shelf and swung it with both hands. The corner of the book caught Gary across the forearm. He grunted, the wrench slipping from his grip and clattering onto the floor. Sarah didn't wait for him to recover. She dove toward a small metal box she had seen him hovering over earlier. Taped to the back was a small silver key. It wasn't a house key. It was professional, numbered, and cold. She snatched it, the metal biting into her palm. "That belongs to the master," Gary hissed, his eyes darting toward the exit. He was humming louder now, a frantic buzzing sound. Sarah kicked a stack of old newspapers into his path, creating a momentary obstacle. She scrambled toward the attic door, her mind racing. She had the poster. She had the key. She had the truth, or at least the beginning of it. She flew down the stairs, her voice a blur of numbers. 10, 11, 12. She burst through the back door into the cool night air. The scent of damp grass and wood smoke filled her lungs, a sharp contrast to the suffocating dust of the attic. She ran for her car, her fingers fumbling with the remote. The lights flashed, a welcoming amber glow in the darkness. She jumped inside, shoved the key into the ignition, and turned it. The engine coughed. A dry, metallic hacking sound echoed through the quiet driveway. Sarah tried again, pumping the gas pedal. Cough sputtered die. The smell of raw gasoline began to waft through the vents, thick and cloying. Sarah climbed out, popping the hood. In the pale moonlight, she saw the damage. The fuel lines hadn't just perished, they had been sliced with surgical precision. A clean, diagonal cut that allowed the lifeblood of the machine to drain onto the gravel. She looked up at the darkened windows of the house. Martha's bedroom was still silent, but Sarah knew. Martha didn't need to be awake to keep her trapped. The house itself was designed to hold her. Sarah grabbed her old mountain bike from the porch. The tires were slightly low, but it would have to do. The bank was 3 miles away, in the city center. The clock on the dashboard had told her she had less than an hour before the vault closed for the weekend. She pedaled hard, the chain groaning with every rotation. The orange glow of the sodium streetlights cast long, distorted shadows across the pavement. Columbus felt different tonight. Not like a home, but like a maze. Every intersection was a choice, every dark alley a potential trap. As she reached the main road, a pair of headlights appeared in her rearview mirror. They were high, wide, and unblinking. A black SUV. It didn't pass. It stayed exactly 20 feet behind her, a silent predator in the night. Sarah accelerated, her lungs burning, the cold air stinging her throat. The SUV surged forward, the roar of its engine drowning out the rhythmic clicking of her bike. It swerved toward her, the heavy bumper missing her rear tire by inches. Sarah veered onto the sidewalk, the jolt of the curb vibrating through her teeth. She didn't look back. She knew who was in that car. Robert Thompson, the man her mother's lawyer called when things got untidy. She dove into a narrow pedestrian alleyway, the handlebars of her bike scraping against the brick walls. The SUV screeched to a halt at the entrance, unable to follow. Sarah pedaled until the alley ended in a dead-end courtyard filled with overflowing trash bins and the stench of rotting produce. She jumped off the bike, looking for an exit. A heavy door creaked open behind her. Robert stepped out, his suit perfectly pressed, his eyes scanning the area with tactical precision. He checked his watch. "You're making this very difficult, Sarah," he said, his voice calm and devoid of emotion. "The key. Just give it to me, and we can go home. Your mother is worried." "My mother is a kidnapper." Sarah spat, backing away until her shoulders hit the cold brick. Robert moved with the efficiency of a machine. He lunged for her bag, his fingers catching the strap. Sarah swung the heavy bike chain she had unlooped from her frame. The metal links whistled through the air, catching Robert across the ribs. He gasped, the air leaving his lungs in a sharp hiss, but he didn't stop. He pinned her against the wall, his hand closing around her throat. The pressure was immense. Sarah's vision began to blur at the edges. She reached into her pocket, her fingers closing around the silver safe deposit key. It was jagged and sharp. She drove the metal tip into Robert's thigh with every ounce of strength she had left. He roared in pain, his grip loosening just enough for Sarah to twist away. She grabbed her bike and shoved it into his path as he tried to limp after her. She didn't look back as she sprinted toward the main street, her heart a frantic drumbeat in her ears. She reached the bank with 5 minutes to spare. The marble lobby was freezing, the air conditioning a biting 60 degrees. Her fingers were numb, making it difficult to hold the pen as she signed the access form. The vault manager, a man with a face like a funeral director, led her into the back. The safe deposit box was small, tucked away in the bottom row. Sarah inserted the key. It turned with a heavy, satisfying clunk. Inside, she didn't find gold or jewelry. She found a stack of envelopes, yellowed with age, and a collection of Polaroids. She opened the first envelope. The handwriting was different, shaky, desperate. It wasn't from a Miller. It was addressed to David Miller, but the return address was a post office box in West Virginia. "Please," the letter began. "Just tell me she's eating. Tell me she's safe. I can't sleep for the sound of the wind in the trees. I see her face in every shadow." Sarah felt the world tilt. These weren't ransom notes. They were the cries of a man who had been kept on a leash for 20 years. David hadn't just stolen a child. He had turned the theft into a lifelong sport, sending James Vance cryptic updates, taunting him with the life he had lost. Sarah didn't go back to the Miller house. She drove through the night, crossing the state line into the jagged hills of West Virginia. The air here smelled of sulfur and wet earth. She found the address from the letters. A dilapidated trailer perched on a rise, its windows like unblinking eyes. James Vance sat on the porch in a rusted lawn chair, a cigarette smoldering between his yellowed fingers. He looked like a man who had been hollowed out by grief. When Sarah stepped out of the car, he didn't stand. He just watched her, his eyes tracing the line of her jaw, the swirl of her hair. "You look like your mother," he whispered. his voice cracking like dry timber. Sarah held out the letters. Why did he have these, James? Why did you let him do this to you for 30 years? She expected him to collapse into her arms, to tell her how he had searched every day. She expected a hero's welcome. Subverted. James took the letters, his hands trembling. He didn't look at them. He looked at the dirt at his feet. I didn't have a choice, he murmured. The money. It was the only way to pay for Linda's medicine. The cancer was eating her alive, and the company had cut my insurance. Sarah felt a prickle of unease. The money. What money? James finally looked up. His eyes weren't filled with the righteous fire of a victim. They were filled with the dull, leaden weight of a man who had made a deal with the devil and lost. David Miller didn't just take you, Sarah. He didn't snatch you from a park. He came to me in the hospital. He saw me crying in the hallway. He told me he could give you a life I couldn't. He told me he could save my wife. Sarah's breath hitched. You sold me? I thought I could get you back, James shouted, his voice suddenly sharp and defensive. I thought once Linda was better, I'd find the money and pay him back. But she never got better, and the money ran out. And then David started sending the pictures. He told me if I ever went to the police, he'd tell them I'd agreed to it. He'd make sure I went to prison for human trafficking. Sarah stepped back, the porch boards groaning under her feet. The man she had traveled across state lines to find, the victim father she thought would be her salvation, was the one who had put the price tag on her head. He hadn't been a mourning parent. He had been a business partner in her disappearance. I kept the grocery lists, James said, pulling a tattered piece of paper from his wallet. He began to copy the words onto a napkin with a shaky hand. Milk, eggs, bread. I thought if I kept the routine, the world would make sense again. The betrayal hit Sarah like a physical blow. Her entire journey, the risk, the blood she had spilled to get here, it was all based on the lie that there was a good side to this story. There was no good side. There was only a buyer and a seller. The front door of the trailer exploded inward. Robert Thompson stepped through the wreckage, a handgun leveled at Sarah's chest. He was limping, his suit ruined, his face a mask of cold fury. The letters, Sarah, he said. The Miller estate doesn't like loose ends. And James here, he's the loosest end of all. James didn't even look up from his napkin. He just kept writing. Butter, flour, sugar. Sarah's hand closed around the handle of a heavy cast-iron skillet sitting on the grease-stained stove. She didn't think. She didn't count. She swung. The heavy iron caught Robert across the wrist, the gun clattering to the floor. The sound of the struggle finally seemed to wake James from his trance. He didn't help her. He didn't grab the gun. He scrambled toward the back door, fleeing into the woods like a frightened animal. Sarah was alone. She ducked as Robert lunged for her, his weight pinning her against the kitchen table. The scent of rotting peaches from the basement rose up to meet her, cloying and sweet. She grabbed a handful of salt from a canister and flung it into his eyes. Robert roared, clutching his face. Sarah didn't wait. She dove for the basement door, throwing the bolt just as he slammed against the wood. She was trapped in the dark, the air thick with the smell of old fruit and damp earth. She could hear Robert pounding on the door above, his voice a low, rhythmic snarl. She turned on her flashlight. The basement was filled with crates, all of them marked with David Miller's meticulous handwriting. Maintenance costs. Inventory. She wasn't a daughter to any of them. She was a line item. Sarah found a loose ventilation grate near the ceiling. She pulled her professional toolkit from her bag, the precision blades she used for her graphic design work. She picked the lock on the grate, the metal clicking softly in the dark. She squeezed through the narrow ductwork, the cold metal biting into her shoulders. She emerged in the tall grass behind the trailer. The police sirens were already wailing in the distance. Mark must have followed the GPS tracker she'd left on her bike. She saw Robert emerge from the front door, his gun back in his hand, his eyes scanning the yard. Sarah didn't run. She picked up a heavy fire extinguisher from the porch and stepped into the light. "Over here, Robert," she said. As he turned, she pulled the pin and squeezed. The white chemical cloud blinded him, and she followed it with a strike to his temple that sent him sprawling. When the police arrived, Sarah was sitting on the bumper of a patrol car, her hands steady for the first time in her life. She watched as they led Robert away in zip ties. She watched as they found James Vance shivering in the brush. She returned to Columbus one last time. Not to stay, but to finish the count. She walked into the Miller house, the scent of lavender and peppermint now smelling like a shroud. Martha sat in the living room, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes gray and vacant. "I did it for you, Sarah," Martha whispered. "I just wanted a daughter." Sarah didn't yell. She didn't cry. She simply placed the stack of bank letters and the missing person poster on the coffee table. "You didn't want a daughter, Martha," Sarah said. "You wanted a possession that didn't talk back. But I'm done being part of the inventory." She walked out the front door, leaving the house of lies behind her. She didn't count the stairs. She didn't look back. In her new apartment in the city, she stood before the mirror. She looked at the jagged scar on her palm, the swirl of hair at her temple. She picked up a pair of socks, one green, one yellow, and pulled them on. She wasn't Amanda Vance, the girl who was sold. And she wasn't Sarah Miller, the girl who was bought. She was the woman who had survived them both. And for the first time, that was enough.